Hello and welcome to Unboxing Russia. My name is Pradnya Bivalkar and I am joined here today by Ekaterina Schulmann. We plan to do this conversation on addressing very complicated topics in both our own countries, Russia and India respectively, in a fortnightly format. And we are here to talk about a variety of topics today that have been coming out of both our countries in the past week or so.
Last time we met, we were talking about elections that were then forthcoming. Since last time, these elections have already happened, and there's quite a lot to be said about it, but other things have been happening too. And now that we are talking, we have just been experiencing, unfortunately, the largest terrorist attack in Russia since 2024. For 20 years, we have not seen mass murder on this scale in, mainland Russia and in Moscow, the capital of the country. So we again, unfortunately, but unavoidably, we'll have to start with that and talk about what we know so far, not being security experts or military experts, and what does it show us about the state of the Russian security and political system? What does it say to us as coming so closely on the heels of the triumph of the presidential election or presidential electoral exercise, as we say, and what the consequences may be? Just to put our readers, our listeners, and watchers within the frame of the events. Yesterday it's not technically Moscow, it's on the outskirts of Moscow, just outside the circular automobile road that goes around the city. In Crocus City Hall, which is one of the biggest entertainment centers, cum shopping malls in Moscow, there was to be a concert of a popular, pop group. 6,200 tickets were sold.
So it was houseful?
Yes, it was a sold out. And I've been in this Crocus City Hall a few years ago. It's really huge. And there's another one next to it, even larger. It's called Vegas. And there's a special subway station constructed and built to serve
these two spaces.
These two spaces, yes. So you have to imagine that it's really a place full of people. Some of these people came to the concert. The concert was to start at 7:30, I think, Moscow time. And the attack started at 7. People began shooting as they were standing in the line. So that's how the first killings began. What happened next, we still fully don't know, because there's, as usual after such events, you inhabit a fog of war. You inhabit an environment where there's too much information. You don't know where it's coming from. You have videos, you have audio recordings, you have people sharing some form of insider information which they think they got. Security services, of course, are doing intentional disinformation, and there's more than one of them on the ground. So it's extremely hard to get to the kernel of truth. But
of the many variants of truths that are going around, what by far in your reading seems to be the most credible one? Of course, it's too early to make a 100%.
It's by far too early. But again, to construct the frame, a few days ago, first the Embassy of United States in Moscow, and then German Embassy and representatives of other European countries warned their citizens and Russians of the imminent danger of a terrorist attack or a terrorist act. And in the message from the US Embassy, it was even mentioned that, according to the information, this terrorist act may happen in the place where masses of people gather. Then there was some examples of what it could be, including concerts. So it was pretty concrete. And after the presidential elections were over, the first public event that the newly elected incumbent went to was the collegium of the FSB, the Federal Security Service. And he gave a speech there where he mentioned this warning, saying that it's evidently an attempt to intimidate or blackmail our society. So he took it as a threat rather than a warning. Now that it has happened, United States officials say that they shared information with the Russian officials and they issued a public warning. And given that, again, to the best of our estimations, the perpetrators were Muslim, not Ukrainians or Americans or Russians, I had a fear yesterday, among the many fears that I have experienced, that they will take hostages and then they will demand cessation of hostilities or eviction of Russian army from Ukrainian territory, and then we'll all will be in a very bad place indeed. We are in a bad enough place as it is. According to the latest information from Russian officials, 133 people are dead. There are numerous casualties. They have not just been shooting people, they have burned the concert hall and the roof has fallen down. Yes, it's amazing how much damage can you do just with a few people with bottles of Molotov's cocktail, because it's a huge structure. But it seems, again, I'm not a firefighter by no means, but it seems that in buildings of this kind, especially newly erected ones, whenever there's a fire, a kind of aerodynamic tower creates itself, and then you have a tower of fire coming upward. So now the special services are working on the place. They are clearing the rubbish, and unfortunately we are to expect an increase in the number of victims.
And are there any conversations happening on what the motivation could have been for the perpetrators?
The one thing that sort of surprised me is this. We have seen many terrorist attacks, unfortunately, in our time. Usually there's the, terrorist part and there's the information part. There are people who do the actual killing or taking hostages or burning or bombing. And there are people who sit in a safe place and issue declarations. They say, we did it because we want this or that. Even if you don't take hostages and don't present your demands, then at least it stands to reason that you have to kind of explain yourself. There has been something like this declaration in a Telegram channel associated with ISIS, or rather one of the departments of ISIS that is based in Afghanistan. They say, we did it. Basically, taking responsibility, I think, is the technical term for this kind of speech, but there was not much else. Which makes it a bit unusual, but at the same time, you may remember similar-looking terrorist attacks in Paris, for example, recently, or here in Germany, when people just, drive a truck into a Christmas market, or start stabbing people with a knife on a bus. Such things happen in Israel time and again. And then there were no declarations. It's like, you know what it means. You know what the message is. So maybe it's this type of attack. President, I don't know if we should be calling him president still, but Russian leader, after about 20 hours since the event, he came out on TV. He declared tomorrow, Sunday, March 24th, the day of national mourning, which is, again, I know it doesn't sound well to say that it's good, but
it's necessary.
It's necessary, and Russian authorities are so averse, usually, at claiming that something bad has happened. They so want to smooth things over that there's this unofficial, cynical-sounding rule that you only have national mourning if there's more than 100 victims. So again, it's unofficial, but usually it holds good. Now we have, again, sadly, tragically, we have more than 100 victims, and then maybe we're going to say more, to have more. He did not exactly say during his TV address that Ukrainian did it or US did it. He said, the one thing he said, it was this. We have caught all the terrorists who've been killing people. They've been moving in the direction of Ukrainian border where a window has been opened for them. These were his exact words, which, cuts both ways. To pass the border, you need this window from both sides, the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. And as almost everyone on both sides now, you can pay to pass this border without documents. This is what happens when you have a war. You have this gray zone, or now it's more like a black zone where there is no law and where, people will be making money by any means, and you can buy anything from a false passport to, a human slave or explosive materials or arms. Just yesterday, when it was happening, and I didn't know it was happening, I was addressing a group of German students, young professionals, partly German, partly Russian. I was answering their questions, and one of my key points was this, that we tend to underestimate the degree of chaos in any given system that we've been habitually watching. We are so used at seeing the same thing day in, day out. We experts even are included in this risk, so that when this system starts deteriorating, we may miss it. And I was saying that it's just from circumstantial evidence, like the statistics published by Russian Ministry of Interior on the growing number of crimes with the use of arms and explosives, we can judge of the fact that there is possibly less order and more chaos than we are aware of. And then I finished my speech and I took my phone and here it was. And my audience was saying, oh, that was very appropriate. You don't want to be appropriate in such a situation. But I've been thinking about, and I've been speaking about the difficulty of explaining this concept of authoritarian fragility, of how autocracies are both stable and not stable. Yeah.
Before we go into that conversation, I think earlier you also mentioned something on the lines of in this almost kind of a cynical parallel universe that Mr. Putin lives in, there is only one potential opponent, and that is the United States, or the Western alliance led by the United States. And now suddenly there is the possibility of having to engage with an opponent called ISIS.
Which we've forgotten all about.
Yeah, but which also doesn't kind of fit in the narrative of, the United States and the West and everything, because it's anything else but that. And then you also said something on the lines of there is a history there with the KGB or the FSB, however you want to call it.
Having a certain mindset and a certain worldview which they follow, not regarding any evidence from reality.
But there's a strong history, like also in terms of Afghanistan and how it goes far back. It's not just like
there's a story popular in the circles how United States has lured Soviet leadership into Afghan war in order to weaken Soviet Union, which actually happened. I have heard these talks time and again, months and weeks before the Ukrainian war started. The idea was the Americans, the bad Americans, or as the now fashionable term is the Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons did it to the aging Soviet Politburo. But we're not like that. We are much more clever. But then it appears to be exactly the same thing, only I highly doubt that there was any luring happening there. But, this kind of Secret Service mentality, it always denies agency to other people and even to themselves. We don't do things, we are provoked into doing things.
But why would the Americans lure the Russians into Afghanistan? What would they gain from it?
They would gain the weakening of a Soviet system.
By keeping them engaged in one war in Afghanistan.
Yes, to have them spend money and then manpower. So the Soviet Union gradually collapsed. So you see, it all happened according to the evil American plan. Somehow things always happen according to evil American plans. But if it appears now with this horrible terrorist act, and again, we haven't seen anything on this scale for 20 years, especially not in Moscow. We've seen a lot of terrorist attacks. They mainly happened between 1999 and 2005. That was our time when there were the first and the second actually war in Chechnya and consequent counter-terrorist operation, as it was officially called. And so there were bombings on planes in the subway. I almost got into one such terrorist act. It was in 2024. It was in 2004. I was working in the State Duma in the Russian parliament, and I had my daily trip on subway, direct line to Okhotny Ryad, to the parliamentary building. And I went there as usual in the morning, and it was a rush hour. At that time, trains go every 40 seconds, and the previous one got bombed. I got on the next one, so it was a very narrow space indeed. And so we spent 2 hours just standing there, and then they brought us back to the previous station and then got us out. I remember it was Friday, and what I did, I didn't go to the Duma that day, so I went back and then got on a bus and then went to Tula, to my parents' place. So I remember it quite well. But after 2005, such large-scale terrorist acts stopped. There was Beslan in 2004, taking hostages in a school on the 1st of September, and absolutely horrific. 3 days and major casualties, including among the children. In 2002, there was hostages taking in a theater in Moscow, the so-called Nordost terrorist act. But here, I think the resemblance is rather not with those previous terrorist acts, but maybe with the events in Europe that I've mentioned, like in Paris or in Germany, or there may be found some resemblance between this and the 7th of October in Israel. Just mass killing of civilians without anything else. No, well, there was a hostage taking in Israel, but again, as far as we know, nothing of this kind in Moscow. So coming back to the Secret Services worldview. So if it transpires that it was an ISIS attack and United States warned us about it, and we dismissed this warning as some sort of threat or distraction on the part of the hostile Americans, then this whole scheme of us being against them in some sort of imaginary league with imaginary global South, it will be possible to gloss this over if you have a full control over your country's media. But, there are other types of media, and people tend to understand things, and it's so much in your face that it will be really hard to convince people that it was Ukrainians who have hired home for citizens of Tajikistan to carry out this, I would say, pretty impressive, if we judge it from a non-human point of view, just as an operation. It was rather well done. Few people, again, lots of casualties, huge media effect, because, again, it's not just some shooting. There were those videos. It was a fire scene from most parts of Moscow, and the roof has fallen down. So it is something, again,
it's left an impact.
Yes, it will leave an impact, and it comes a week after the elections, when
87% majority vote.
87% with 70+% turnout for a candidate whose almost one and only message is security and safety and security.
And we hate the US.
Yes, and standing up to the bad to bad Americans. So, if there is no longer any guarantees of security within Russia, and all this comes on top of the shelling of Belgorod and the evacuation of people there, so mainland Russian territory is no longer safe, and this comes on top of years and years of absolute omnipotence within the country of security services. Again, according to some information that has leaked out, even in this case in Crocus, they've been doing some security checks earlier in the day, because perhaps if there was some warning, they couldn't just dismiss it completely. So they sent somebody to check, and then that's about it.
Yeah,
they let the event go. And at 4:00, there were some police cars near this concert venue. But at 7, people started trickling in. There was a line and a queue. There was this metal thing that beeps when you go through it, manned by a few elderly men and women who work as
private security.
Yes, a private security company, evidently, and that's it. So they can do nothing against men with guns.
Yeah.
So what sociologists call the theater of security.
Security is always a very interesting tool that is often used in electoral but also non-electoral context to keep people, to consolidate support amongst the people, because when you have the other that is kind of challenging you and threatening you, it's easy to have one leader who's going to go and give it back to them. So I think
that's how our president became the national leader in the end of 90s, beginning of 2000, when really and truly Russians felt under threat, and then for
after
a reason.
10 years of chaos.
Well, not exactly chaos, but especially
as he likes to put it.
Yeah, chaotic 90s, and also when we just read a list of this history of terrorist attacks in Russia, it's a lot. It's a lot, and it was news day in, day out, and then it stopped.
Yeah, and
we have sacrificed our freedoms, our civic rights, our political prerogatives for what? For this, for security, for facial screenings, for more police officers per 100,000 people than in any other large country. We're vying with Turkey in this competition. So we have, as I said, omnipotence of security services within the country. There's no one to say no to them. There's no civic control. There's no parliamentary control. All the people we call technocrats, that is civic bureaucracy, they live in daily fear for their life and freedom because they are defenseless against the community of the Siloviki. And within this community, FSB is the first and foremost. Primus inter pares. MVD, the Minister of the Interior, the police is rather downtrodden. And by the way, they've been stripped of, recently, they've been stripped of their own armed departments. So they've been moved to another security body called Rosgvardia, which is basically anti-riot police. And yesterday, it appeared that some of the Rosgvardia people were on the ground when it happened, but not the special forces of the FSB. The famous Alpha regiment, who are supposed to be best at storming buildings and delivering hostages, etc. They are specifically trained for this. Perhaps they are not in Moscow. Perhaps they are nearer to the front line.
Closer to the window.
Closer to the window, yes.
But
exactly.
Let's go to something that happened a few days before this attack yesterday, which was the electoral exercise, or the event, that as you referred to it, and where your dear president came out with a massive majority with huge turnout.
We have not seen anything like this in our whole post-Soviet history. It's the largest result ever.
Yeah,
the turnout has also been phenomenal. People have been referring to it as a Turkmen result, but I don't want to put any ethnic coloring on this. There is no ethnicity to autocracy. We have seen the same kind of results in any authoritarian regime that cares about showing up now and flaunting their electoral records and record-breaking figures. It happens in Latin America. It happens in the African countries. It happens in, it would happen in a European country like Portugal or Spain,
absolutely.
when they had their periods of dictatorships. So it's not about ethnicity at all. But of course, the first association in the minds of Russians is with our Central Asian neighbors who love the 90% result. By the way, the recent elections in Azerbaijan also showed 90-something, but these came...
Of course, there's an impression that people are so committed to democracy. So many of them go out to vote. So many of them then have a unanimous consensus, and everyone's like, this is the person we want to vote for, and this should be the person that goes into the office. I think sometimes one cannot help but wonder if democracy has kind of become more like by the privileged, of the privileged, for everyone. It's not anymore necessarily by the people, for the people, and all of that. I think there's a very clear segregation of who holds what stakes and what role they have to play.
I'm afraid if you go down that dangerous path of thinking, you'll come to the necessity of limiting the right of universal ballot. We don't want that.
No, you don't want that, but you also cannot help but wonder because, we've been talking about elections in your country. We'll also talk about elections coming up in my country. But, and when we start talking about these countries, there is a increasing number of countries who have gone the authoritarian way, who have gone the autocratic way.
The increasing number of countries have set up elections. That's why in this general mass, there will be more autocracies than democracies, because democracy is high maintenance, not in the sense of expensive, but in the sense of it requires effort. So again, I don't quite agree with you. I don't quite agree with you here. Because you seem to be implying that there's something inherently flawed with the election mechanism as such.
No, but I think I'm not saying there's an inherent flaw in the mechanisms of an election, but the whole notion of what democracy stands for, I think that has, unfortunately, by the given circumstances, taken on a different form. Not by its own virtue, but by the way things have evolved. So, for instance, I don't know, like today, if you in a country like India, if you don't have the right people to bless you and sign off your candidacy, I don't think you can be a part of any kind of an election campaign. To be honest, you cannot.
Election candidates rarely come out of nowhere.
But sometimes they do. I think in a good democracy, that should be an option, right? Like if you're doing some good work, there should be some space for you.
Yes, but you are doing some good work, or you are a party member and you are rising from bottom to the higher ranks, or you've been doing something, and if you've been doing something, you've been also establishing connections. And when you put it like this, the necessary people will bless you. Then it sounds like a description of a very privileged environment. But if you put it differently, again, for example, you are head of an NGO, you communicate with public, doctors, officials, media, they come to know you, you form connections. You have some sort of web. And then one day you say, you know what, I want to run for my municipal legislature. I want to be an MP. And they say, good for you, we support you. And then you go to official you work with and you tell him or her that, and they say, okay, we will be happy to have you there. Is this blessing by the necessary people, or is this a natural process of, social growth and development?
It's very difficult to answer that question because, again, especially from the context that I'm looking at right now in my personal space, even if it were to be a natural process of getting into that conversation of throwing your hat into the ring, being a candidate on the ballot and all of that, you may have done everything that leads to that natural process coming to its fruition in a way. But if you don't have the right credentials right now, and right with pun intended, I don't think you can make the right way. And I think we'll also briefly talk about the arrest of one of the sitting chief ministers of the North.
Tell me about it. I'm always, interested in the wiles of autocrats.
It's quite fascinating because Arvind Kejriwal, who's been arrested, who is the sitting chief minister of the state of New Delhi, the
So in our terms, he's the head of a regional government of the state of Bengal.
Of New Delhi.
New Delhi, which is a state, not the city.
It's also a city. It's a city-state.
It's a city-state. So it's like Moscow.
Or Berlin. I don't know what Moscow is, but Berlin or Hamburg would come.
Because there's Moscow and there's Moscow region. They have
so
separate
NCR,
governments.
the National Capital Region, that would kind of explain it. But so he's been arrested and
on charges of
corruption. Of a bill that was passed a few years ago and then that was discontinued, and he's been arrested by the Enforcement Directorate because he refused to turn up in the courts
so he was
hearings.
accused first and then arrested
so because
later.
he didn't take those accusations seriously, so he didn't turn up, and now he's been arrested. And he's one of the figures. He's quite fascinating because in regional elections, in the state elections, his party has consistently performed well in the past two elections.
He represents a political party.
Which is not the governing party.
Is he a popular public figure?
He is popular but also controversial. So he came out of nowhere, like the typical person that we were describing, who's done some good work. He used to be, he was a part of a public movement that came along a few years ago, which was called the Jan Lokpal movement, and he came out of that movement. The other two people who were with him kind of fell on the sidelines. He made it into the political fray. Now he's a part of it. And he's also a very important player in this anti-BJP, which is the governing party bloc that has kind of joined forces looking at the elections that are coming up.
He was elected to this position.
Yes. Yes. But now they have arrested him, which also means that...
can you arrest an elected official? It's usually a bit tricky in most of the legal systems.
It is, but that's how they have kind of pulled it off. They've kind of found some loopholes, some gray zones, and then it also depends on what kind of legislation you use to file the case, under what code and what section and all of that. So I think they've been very smart at it, but without going into too much of the nitty-gritties, I think the optics of it matter. We are probably, today it's the 23rd of March. In less than a month's time, we go for elections, starting on the 19th of April. And he's one of the popular figures from this opposition, whatever is remaining of that.
Was he going to participate in these elections in any way?
He was definitely going to be a voice in the anti-government.
So he had his position. He was not running for any other post, but
no.
he was supposed to be.
He's also the head of a party that is kind of a part.
And party has, of course, its own list of candidates.
Exactly.
I see.
So now he's kind of gone, and the problem with that is that within his own party setup, there is no one who's comparable in terms of his stature that people would take seriously.
Would you read it as a plain-faced, open-faced attempt on the part of Prime Minister Modi to silence a dissenting voice?
Of course. So
the simplest reading is also the most probable.
It's most probable, and of course, like, the naysayers are going to come and say, but what about this? He did this corruption and he did that and all of that. It may stand its own value, but then I'm thinking, then why do it now? You could have done it when he did not take the first few summons seriously, when the court summoned him and he didn't go. Why did you have to wait for so long and hit at the point where it's just a few weeks before the election? And the timing of it makes you question a lot of things. So I'm not saying that he may or may not have been party to a corrupt procedure, but the fact that you did not arrest him earlier is what is raising questions. But anyway, coming back to the whole authoritarian, electoral, autocracies, democracies, all of these very heavy words. So let's talk about something that you alluded to earlier, which was the authoritarian fragility, because I'm also wondering, depending on how you look at it, if I have some connection or connecting points to see where my country stands. Because as of now, we also spoke about this in the last conversation, where we are right now, in my eyes, it's a very gray area between electoral autocracy, which is very personalized, where Mr. Modi is the person that kind of holds all of that together, but he goes there through the way of a ballot.
And he also had a party, which, as if I understand it right, is a real party, unlike Russia's majority party, United Russia, which is not connected to anything.
It is a big
in
party.
A society.
It's a legit political party with big history.
Being big is not the whole thing. So it has a original structure, some real people who are party members. No, with big I meant
it also is a very historically relevant.
Okay, so it was not an ad hoc structure
not
created
at all.
specifically
not
for to serve the interests of the Prime Minister.
Not at all.
And does it serve as a career ladder? So if you're an ambitious young person, would it serve your interest to become a party member and then climb up?
Of course. If you see about how a lot of people from the regional parties in the past few years have kind of jumped the wagon, like from this to that. I think they realize that if they want to have a serious career in politics, they cannot afford to be on the wrong side. So either you have a very strong family name with a legacy, like the Gandhis, that you can afford to still have some traction with media, with some influential decision makers, or you just jump the wagon and you go on the other side, and then you kind of join hands with the BJP, because otherwise you will be left with nothing.
Because in Russia, that's not the case. United Russia is not a real party. First, it was constructed back in, I think, between 2002 and 2004, when 4 pro-governmental fractions in the State Duma united into one. And it doesn't serve as a career ladder, paradoxically, but the other way around. When you rise, after a certain point, you are advised to become tacitly a party member. That's it. But you need to rise first by either being a member of the family, and that in these later stages of our authoritarian evolution becomes more and more important. Again, maybe I shouldn't be telling this to you specifically, but it strikes me as extremely archaic and barbaric to have family connections and blood relations so important in a developed society. Of course, families will be important always, because it's the core organizational unit of any social structure. But to have so many children and now even grandchildren occupying positions in the political hierarchy, it's kind of frustrating.
But I think that's also what makes people like Mr. Modi very popular, because
as you said, he has no family.
Yeah, and that's what kind of gives him this very holier than thou, I am better than the rest because I have nothing to lose, that kind of an image.
Nor anything to gain, because he can't he can't put his children as successors.
Yeah, but there's a bigger picture which most of the people don't see, which is the vision that a political party has for a country, and not necessarily this person. So it's a very dirty playing ground, because there is a lot of elements of one person driving this entire conversation and deciding what way to go. But the vision that he carries is the vision of a party, which comes from a very different ethos. But yeah, I think we can do episodes and episodes just on that.
Coming back to our authoritarian fragility concept, you have already touched on the point that it's very much to the advantage of, specifically of an autocracy, but by extension of any political model, political regime, to have an enemy. To have a clear enemy. It kind of energizes people into properly rallying around the flag. It puts you up as a leader.
It scares them enough.
Yes, in a position of not just a political leader, but a national savior, etc. But there's a catch. You can use real enemies, which usually serves you better. It's also cheaper. But if you have this absolute secret security service mentality, you are much more effective against an enemy of your own invention.
Oh, you're looking for enemies everywhere.
Yes. And in case of Russia, again, initially when our president was younger and way more popular, he stood up as fighting against Islamic terrorism, which was very much of a real thing. But later on, it all turned to fighting against internal enemies, which were mostly urban dwellers who wanted more freedoms and civic rights. And the story was that they are not real actors. They have no agency. They are puppets of the West. The evil Anglo-Saxons are driving protests inside the country because, the evil Anglo-Saxons can do absolutely anything. They can organize at the drop of a hat any number of protesters in any place in Russia. So the question what the great and terrible FSB is doing in all this environment remains unanswered. So Coming back to ISIS, currently there's quite a widely publicized political court process going on in Russia. Two women writers have been arrested for setting up a play in a theater. They got actually a prize for this a few years ago. The play is about the so-called ISIS brides. Russian women, girls and women who have been seduced online into...
brainwashed.
Yes, brainwashed online into, going over to Syria and other places, marrying terrorists, fighters there. Some of them managed to come back, some of them not. The play consists of bits of their evidence, their statements. So it's, again, basically, it's of course an anti-terrorist play serving as a warning of what a trap you can get into if you start talking online with an interesting stranger who has ideas. But they've been arrested for propagating terrorist ideas. And they've been now in prison for more than a year. And the case stands on a number of expertises written by experts from the FSB. This is the way they fight terrorism. And if you are so busy with that, and if you are so busy hunting Navalny's supporters, identifying people who went to a funeral through facial recognition system and harassing them in their homes or in their workplaces, then of course you have no resources left to watch, some actual terrorists who may turn up. Because you have your worldview where you're fighting against Anglo-Saxons.
And you're paranoid.
And you talk to your paranoia and to the voices in your head. But there are other paranoics out there. And
real paranoids.
You are real too. But they also have guns.
Yeah, that's what I meant. People who actually can not sitting and twiddling their thumbs and creating enemies. They just actually go and do stuff.
They go and then they shoot people in a theater. We've seen these videos. They are horrific. I would advise no one to watch them. Shooting a group of people at close range looks dreadful, as you perhaps imagine it should. So, my point being, you may flatter yourself into believing that you are, again, standing up against this evil world hegemon, the states, in cooperation and coordination with the global south. And if you have suddenly become friends with Hamas and with the Iranian ayatollahs, it may convince you that you now have traction with the Muslim world in general. But I'm no expert in the Muslim world, but even I know that it is by no means unified. And if you go to bed with the Sunnis, the Shiites will be unhappy, and then the other way around. So, if it appears suddenly that we've been fighting the wrong enemy all along, that we are, again, if we go to this ethnic religious side of things, if we've been killing a neighboring Christian nation at the time when we should be actually maybe leaguing with the Western countries in order to do something about a terrorist and, by the way, drug dealing threat in Afghanistan, which is much closer to us than it is to Americans. This will break this whole scheme.
Look at the real enemies instead of considering the religion and the ethnicity parameter of it, or the Western parameter of it. Look at the real enemy.
And maybe try to be a little more discriminating rather than dividing the whole world into, how you put it, the West and the rest. And of course, security services mentality never allows anyone but the main players to have agency. So Ukraine doesn't exist. It's just a stooge of the West. Europe doesn't exist either, if you want to know.
They don't have their own minds.
No, they don't. They are absolutely governed on a daily basis by Washington. So it may strike you as ridiculous. It strikes me as ridiculous.
Because Washington doesn't have its own problems.
Of course not. And what it's busy with is micromanaging Europe.
And they don't have the problem of Trump coming in or anything.
Trump is not the problem. Trump is the solution.
Trump is our friend, yes.
Yes, of course. Now Trump will come in the next few months and make everything well. Again, how that corresponds to the real situation on the ground. Actually, again, I don't go into foreign policy much, as you know, but even I can understand that American forces leaving Afghanistan
in a hurry.
In a rather disgraceful fashion. It didn't look nice at all. But there was so much Schadenfreude in Russia about it. Look how weak the Americans are.
They just left.
Yes, they just left. And the parallel wars, I've heard a lot of it. This is the way they will leave their allies in Ukraine as well.
Oh.
So they will cling to
that's the
airplanes leaving Kiev, as now they're trying to get on a plane leaving Kabul. But I was wondering, even back then in 2020, what is there to be so happy about? Americans and their Afghan allies were upholding and keeping some sort of decent looking order in Afghanistan, but now it's no longer the case. And, it's all very well to play the part of a trickster, an international trickster, trying to harm Americans anywhere we can. If we can do it in Syria, well and good. If we can do it in imaginary Ukraine, well and good. But this is kind of childish behavior. And in order to do your teenage revolt, you have to be internally quite sure that the parent will stand up to you anyway. But this is not how international politics works. No one is a parent to no one.
No.
So this leaves us as a country in an extremely precarious situation.
Also very fragile.
That's the fragility. So
it's not just a personal, it's also structural, institutional fragility.
So why were we so happy about dismantling the old unjust world order? Why, again, I'm asking these questions in good faith because I'm not a specialist in international relations. Why were we considering that the new world order will be more to our advantage than the previous one?
That's $1 million question. And no one's been able to answer it.
No.
Netflix is trying through their new documentary.
But what documentary is this?
It's called Turning Point, or in German it's called Wendepunkt, and it addresses the Cold War, right from the end of the Second World War and from that point on. It's quite fascinating.
Is it a documentary or
it's a documentary?
Or a mockumentary?
No, it's really a well-made, well-researched documentary where, in fact, that's in a very bizarre fashion. There were moments where I who more than often I like to believe I have a reflected way of thinking, but there were moments where I was like, of course the Russians were right. Of course this was necessary to, kind of stand up to the Americans and do this and do that. And I'm like, it doesn't add up. And it's quite fascinating to go through that experience. So the Netflix is trying to find an answer to that question.
Okay, maybe Netflix will help. When all else fails, we always have Netflix to explain things to us.
But yeah, so I think on that slightly funny, I think because humor is something that is the only way you can turn to when everything else is so.
And I'll have to be commenting on these tragic events
for the coming days.
For the coming days. So I need something to keep my spirits up.
So I think with that good laugh, we can call it a day, a week, whatever, and hope that the next conversation doesn't start with something as sad as our conversation today.
Never a dull day in Russia. That's our national motto. Something happens all the time. But we do genuinely hope to be with you in
2 weeks' time.
In 2 weeks' time. So we pride ourselves in now starting this thing on a regular basis. We hope to reach some sort of audience, modest at first, but then then we'll be as much watched as Netflix. That's our ambition.
So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.